Can you imagine discovering an abandoned newborn on your doorstep without knowing it belongs to the person closest to you? Thomas Bennett, a renowned cardiac surgeon in Boston, never imagined his life would turn 180 degrees on a frigid November morning. A small wicker basket would forever change his destiny and that of two people who didn't even know they were connected by the purest love that exists. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new stories that remind us what truly matters in life. The clock showed 5:30 in the morning when Thomas Bennett stepped out of his luxurious townhouse in the exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. Like every day for the past 6 years, he was heading to his office before the rest of the world awakened from their dreams. At 38 years old, he had built a medical career that had earned him international recognition and allowed him to live more than comfortably. But it had also transformed him into a man who measured everything in terms of efficiency and professional achievement. His expensive tailored suits and his silver Audi were his armor against a world he had learned to see only as cases to solve and procedures to perfect, never as human connections to nurture or relationships to build. He had never married, never had children, and frankly, had never felt the necessity or desire to pursue either of those paths that seemed to complicate the lives of his colleagues unnecessarily. His existence was perfectly ordered and controlled, without unexpected disruptions or surprises that could derail his carefully constructed routine. Or at least that's what he believed until that particular morning, when everything he thought he knew about himself would be completely challenged. His morning ritual was sacred and unvarying. Black coffee with no sugar, medical journals reviewing the latest surgical techniques, and straight to the hospital without deviation. But when he opened the heavy front door of his historic brownstone, something completely out of the ordinary was waiting for him on the granite steps that led to the sidewalk. A small wicker basket sat carefully positioned on the top step, covered with what appeared to be a hand-knitted pink blanket that looked both new and lovingly made. At first, Thomas thought it was some kind of elaborate prank orchestrated by his younger residents who occasionally tried to inject humor into his serious demeanor, or perhaps a gift from a grateful patient's family, though the placement seemed odd for that purpose. But when he approached cautiously and pulled back the soft pink blanket that covered the contents, his heart literally stopped beating for several seconds, a sensation he recognized from his medical training but had never personally experienced. Inside the basket was an infant, a tiny baby girl who couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 weeks old based on his clinical assessment, sleeping peacefully as if this were the most natural place in the world for her to be resting. Her impossibly small fists were clenched tightly, and her breathing was soft and irregular in that way newborns breathe that always seems concerning until you understand it's completely normal for their developmental stage. Thomas looked around frantically, searching for some explanation, some trace of whoever might have left this child in such a vulnerable position on his doorstep. The tree-lined streets of Beacon Hill were completely empty and silent at this early hour. Only the sound of distant traffic and the occasional bird broke the eerie quiet of the exclusive residential neighborhood where something this unexpected simply didn't happen. A small note was tucked inside the basket, written in trembling handwriting that spoke of desperation and pain, saying simply in blue ink on lined paper, "Please take care of her. I have no other choice in this world. May God bless you for your kindness." Thomas felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation expanding in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years of maintaining emotional distance from his patients and their families. It wasn't quite compassion in the traditional sense, but it also wasn't something he could simply ignore and walk away from as if he'd seen nothing unusual. The baby looked healthy and well cared for despite her abandonment. Someone had clearly put tremendous love and attention into preparing this tiny refuge for her. Her clothes were clean and appeared new, purchased specifically for this purpose, and there was even a small stuffed rabbit accompanying her, worn enough to suggest it had meaning to whoever left her. "What the hell do I do now?" Thomas muttered to himself, running a hand through his perfectly styled silver-streaked hair in a gesture of rare uncertainty. He had delivered babies during his medical school rotations decades ago, but he knew absolutely nothing about diapers, feeding schedules, or anything related to actual infant care beyond the clinical basics. But he also couldn't simply leave her there exposed to the elements and pretend he hadn't seen anything, walk away and let someone else deal with this impossible situation. His conscience, which he believed had been completely suppressed after years of making life and death decisions in the operating room, began to awaken slowly and insistently. Thomas carefully lifted the basket, surprised by how light it was, how fragile this entire setup seemed, and carried it back inside the warmth of his townhouse. The baby continued sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the profound dilemma she had created simply by existing in the life of this surgeon who had everything planned and controlled. Thomas stood motionless in his elegant marble foyer, looking alternately at the infant and at his phone, his mind racing through options and protocols. His first instinct as a medical professional was to call the police immediately or contact Child Protective Services, the logical and legally required response to finding an abandoned infant. But something deep in his core told him to wait, to pause before making that call that would remove this child from his life forever. Maybe it was the way the tiny baby moved her lips while dreaming, or the blind trust with which someone had placed this precious life directly into his hands specifically, not just anywhere but on his doorstep. For the first time in many years, Thomas Bennett didn't know exactly what the correct course of action was, and that uncertainty was almost as disturbing as finding the baby itself. The sound of a key turning in the front door lock pulled him sharply from his swirling thoughts and mounting panic. Rebecca Hayes, his private nurse who managed his home medical office, arrived as she did every morning at precisely 6:30 to prepare for his afternoon consultations with private patients. She was a young woman of 27 who had been working for him for nearly 3 years, always punctual to the minute, always professionally efficient, always maintaining appropriate boundaries. Thomas respected her tremendously for her work ethic and clinical skills, but he had never paid much personal attention to her as a human being beyond her professional contributions to his practice. "Good morning, Dr. Bennett," Rebecca said as she entered through the side door that led directly to his home office. But she stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the scene in front of her, her medical bag nearly slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Her green eyes widened dramatically and her face went completely pale, drained of all color as if she'd seen something that shook her to her core. The basket with the infant was now resting on the antique console table in the foyer, and Thomas was standing beside it with an expression of total bewilderment that was completely unlike his usual composed demeanor. "A baby," Rebecca whispered, and something in her voice made Thomas look at her with more attention than he usually paid to anyone's emotional state. There was a strange emotion flickering in her eyes, something that looked almost like recognition mixed with fear and an inexplicable sadness. "I found her on my doorstep this morning," Thomas explained, still trying to process the situation himself. "Someone abandoned her here without any explanation beyond a brief note." Rebecca approached slowly as if in a trance, as if being pulled forward by an invisible force she couldn't resist. And when she finally saw the baby's face clearly in the soft morning light filtering through the foyer windows, her eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to hide by turning her face away and blinking rapidly. "She's beautiful," Rebecca murmured, and her voice cracked and broke on the last word in a way that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Thomas noticed that her hands were trembling visibly as she reached toward the basket, but he attributed her reaction to the natural shock that any person would experience when confronted with an abandoned infant, not recognizing it as something far more personal and devastating. "I don't know what to do with her," Thomas admitted, feeling strangely vulnerable as he confessed his complete ignorance about something outside his area of medical expertise. I don't have any experience with infants beyond delivering them and handing them to the pediatrics team." Rebecca looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret in his emotionally limited understanding of human reactions. There was pain clearly visible in her eyes, but also something deeper and more complex, like a silent recognition of fate's cruel ironies. "I know how to care for babies," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have younger siblings back home. I've been taking care of infants since I was barely a teenager myself." Without waiting for his response or permission, she moved decisively toward his kitchen and returned moments later with a bottle of warm water and a clean cloth. "First, we need to check if she's hungry or needs a diaper change," Rebecca explained with practiced naturalness, as if caring for abandoned babies was a routine part of her job description rather than an extraordinary emergency. Thomas observed her with growing curiosity and a strange sense of relief as Rebecca moved with a confidence and tenderness he had never witnessed in their 3 years of professional interaction. The question that had begun forming in Thomas's analytical mind dissolved temporarily when the baby started crying softly, a sound that seemed to pierce something in his chest he didn't know existed. Rebecca immediately leaned over the basket and lifted the infant with such practiced ease and natural grace that it left the surgeon completely impressed despite his usual emotional detachment. "There, little sweetheart. Everything's going to be all right," Rebecca murmured in a voice so tender it was almost unrecognizable from her usual professional tone, rocking the baby with an instinctive swaying motion that seemed to calm the infant almost immediately. Thomas watched the scene with fascination that was growing into something he couldn't quite name or understand. He had never seen his nurse in such a maternal and warm capacity, had never imagined her outside her professional role. She needs formula, Rebecca said without taking her eyes off the baby's face, studying every feature with an intensity that seemed to go beyond professional concern. And diapers and extra clothes and a proper crib with appropriate bedding. Her list was practical and urgent, as if every passing minute was crucial for the well-being of this child, as if delay would cause harm that could be prevented. Thomas felt a strange sensation in his chest while observing this interaction, something warm and unfamiliar. There was something almost magical in the way the baby calmed in Rebecca's arms, as if she recognized her on some primal level, as if this was exactly where she belonged in the universe. "Where do we get all of that?" Thomas asked, surprising himself by using the word we instead of I. It was as if he had automatically included Rebecca in solving this unexpected dilemma that had appeared on his doorstep, as if they were partners in this rather than doctor and employee dealing with an emergency. "There's a baby supply store about 15 minutes from here," Rebecca responded, still gently rocking the infant in her arms with movements that looked completely natural and unrehearsed. "But Dr. Bennett, are you certain you want to involve yourself in this situation?" The question was valid and direct, cutting through the emotional confusion to the practical reality. But something in the way Rebecca phrased it made Thomas stop and truly reflect on what exactly he was doing and why. He was a cardiac surgeon with an international reputation to maintain, not a social worker or a savior of abandoned children who appeared mysteriously on doorsteps. His life was perfectly structured and planned, every minute accounted for and scheduled to maximize his professional productivity and medical contributions. An infant had no place in that carefully balanced equation. She was unpredictable and demanding and completely irrational in her needs. But while looking at the tiny baby in Rebecca's arms, something fundamental shifted inside him that he didn't fully understand. Maybe it was the way the child had appeared specifically on his doorstep, as if fate had made a deliberate choice. Or maybe it was the blind trust of whoever had left her there, believing he would do the right thing even though they couldn't have known what kind of man he really was. "I can't simply hand her over to the authorities," Thomas said quietly, speaking as much to himself as to Rebecca, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. At least not without trying to find her parents first and understand what circumstances led to this desperate act. Rebecca nodded slowly, but Thomas noticed something change in her expression when he mentioned finding the parents, a shadow that crossed her features so quickly he almost missed it in his focus on the practical problems before them. "Of course, Dr. Bennett," she murmured in a voice that sounded strained and carefully controlled. "That's the right thing to do, the responsible course of action." But her voice sounded strange and hollow, as if the words cost her something to speak, as if she was forcing herself to agree with something that caused her pain. "For now, we need to care for her properly and make sure she's healthy," Rebecca continued, returning her gaze to the baby with that inexplicable tenderness that seemed to flow from her naturally. "We can't leave her like this without the basic necessities that every infant requires for survival and comfort." Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself with its spontaneity and departure from his usual careful deliberation. "Let's go," he said, moving toward the door with sudden purpose. "We'll buy everything she needs. You know what to look for based on your experience. I'll take care of paying for whatever's necessary." Rebecca looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that he couldn't identify in his limited emotional vocabulary. "Really, Dr. Bennett?" she asked, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing from this man known for his emotional distance. "You're willing to do this for a baby you don't even know, a child who isn't your responsibility in any way?" The question was fair and reasonable, but Thomas realized he had already made the decision in some deep place in his heart that operated independently of his logical mind. "Someone trusted me enough to leave this child on my doorstep," he responded, feeling the weight of that trust settling on his shoulders. "I can't betray that faith by simply handing her off to the system without ensuring she's properly cared for first." The trip to the baby supply store was revealing in ways Thomas hadn't anticipated or prepared himself for emotionally. Rebecca carried the infant with absolute naturalness and practiced ease, as if she had been born specifically for this purpose. She knew exactly which formula to purchase based on the baby's approximate age, which type of diapers would work best, what size clothing would fit properly. While Thomas paid a bill that could easily have fed a family for 2 months without thinking twice about the cost, he observed how Rebecca interacted with the baby girl in her arms. She spoke to her in sweet whispers that he couldn't quite hear, smiled at her as if they shared private secrets, calmed her with small sounds and movements that seemed to have an almost magical effect on the infant's mood. "It seems like you already know her," Thomas commented while loading bags into his car, trying to make sense of what he was observing. Rebecca tensed slightly at the observation, but maintained her focus on the baby she was cradling protectively. "All babies are fundamentally the same," she responded, but her voice sounded forced and rehearsed rather than natural. "They just need unconditional love and constant attention. Nothing more complicated than that." Thomas felt there was something more in that response, some deeper truth she wasn't sharing, but he didn't press the issue or push for clarification. Instead, he found himself watching the way she instinctively protected the infant from the cold November wind, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she had been doing this her entire life. There was a grace in her movements and a confidence that contrasted completely with his own awkwardness when he had attempted to hold the baby for a brief moment earlier. It was as if Rebecca had been specifically designed to care for this particular child, as if fate had orchestrated this entire situation. Back at the townhouse, Thomas observed how Rebecca transformed one of his sterile guest bedrooms into a perfect space for the baby with remarkable efficiency. She organized the crib they had purchased, prepared bottles with precise measurements, folded the new clothes with meticulous care that spoke of practice and familiarity. "You've done this before," Thomas stated rather than asked, watching her work with smooth efficiency. Rebecca paused for a moment, her hand stilling on a small pink blanket that matched the one the baby had arrived in. "Like I said, Dr. Bennett, I have younger siblings," she responded in that same carefully controlled voice. But again her tone had that strange quality, as if she were hiding something significant beneath the surface of her words. Thomas decided not to insist or interrogate further, but a seed of curiosity had been planted firmly in his mind that would only grow stronger. As he watched her feed the baby with infinite patience, singing softly under her breath in a voice he'd never heard her use before, he realized there was something profoundly beautiful about the entire scene unfolding in his formerly empty house. For the first time in years, his home felt like an actual living space filled with purpose and meaning beyond simply being a place to sleep between hospital shifts. "How should we name her?" Thomas asked suddenly, the question emerging without conscious thought. Rebecca looked up, clearly surprised by the question and its implications. "Name her," she repeated as if testing the words. "She needs a name," Thomas explained, feeling more certain about this than he had about anything else that morning. "We can't just call her the baby forever as if she doesn't have an identity." Rebecca smiled genuinely for the first time since that morning, and it was like watching the sun emerge after a long dark night, transforming her entire face. "Emma," she said without a moment's hesitation, as if the name had been waiting on her lips for years. The speed with which Rebecca had chosen the name Emma resonated in Thomas's mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing, creating echoes of questions he couldn't quite formulate. It was as if the name had been prepared and waiting, ready to be spoken at precisely this moment, as if by design rather than chance. "Emma," Thomas repeated, testing how it sounded in his own voice and finding it felt right somehow. "It's a strong name, beautiful and classic. I like it very much." He observed how Rebecca's eyes brightened when he approved her choice, as if his opinion carried tremendous weight for her, as if his validation of this name meant something far deeper than simply agreeing on what to call an abandoned infant. During the following days, Thomas attempted to maintain his normal work routine at the hospital, but discovered it was practically impossible to concentrate on surgical procedures and patient consultations the way he once had. His mind constantly wandered back to images of Emma sleeping peacefully in her improvised nursery, or to the soft sounds Rebecca made to calm her when she cried during the night that he could hear through the walls. He had hired a professional nanny with excellent references to come during the daytime hours when Rebecca was busy with his medical practice. But for some inexplicable reason, Emma always seemed calmer and more content when Rebecca was nearby, as if she could sense her specific presence. The nanny, an older woman with decades of childcare experience, had commented more than once how unusual this connection was between Rebecca and the baby. "It's almost like they already know each other," she had observed without understanding how prophetic her casual observation actually was. Thomas began arriving home earlier each afternoon, driven by an unfamiliar anxiety to know how Emma had spent her day and whether she was thriving under their care. It was a Friday evening when Thomas found Rebecca in the kitchen preparing a bottle with the precision of someone who had performed this exact task thousands of times before. Emma was cradled in her arms, completely calm and peaceful, gazing up at Rebecca with those large, curious eyes that seemed to absorb and memorize every detail of her face. "Dr. Bennett," Rebecca began, and there was something different in her voice, a determination and resolve he had never heard before in their professional interactions. I need to talk with you about something important that's been on my mind. Thomas felt a sharp pang of concern, immediately fearing she was going to resign and leave just when Emma had begun to form part of their daily routine and seemed so attached to her care. Of course, Rebecca. What's on your mind? He responded, trying to keep his voice neutral despite his internal worry. She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for something monumentally difficult. I've been thinking about Emma's situation, she began, rocking the baby gently with those practice motions that seemed completely automatic. The nanny is very competent and professional, but Emma needs constant care and attention, especially during the nights when babies don't understand schedules or convenience. Thomas nodded in agreement, having noticed the dark circles under his own eyes from waking every time Emma cried in the early morning hours. What do you suggest? He asked, though something in his gut already knew where this conversation was heading. I would like to move in here, Rebecca said, the words tumbling out in a rapid stream as if she had been rehearsing them for days. There's a bedroom right next to Emma's nursery that I could use. I could take care of her during the nights and be available whenever she needs me during the day as well. Thomas looked at her with genuine surprise, not because the idea was unreasonable or inappropriate, but because secretly he had been desperately hoping for exactly this solution without knowing how to propose it himself. Are you absolutely sure? He asked carefully. It would be an enormous change for your life and routine. You wouldn't have your privacy anymore, your independent life outside of work. Rebecca looked down at Emma, who had started drifting off to sleep in her arms with complete trust and contentment. Dr. Bennett, she murmured softly, this little sweetheart needs me in ways I can't fully explain. And she stopped as if about to say something more personal and revealing, but controlled herself at the last moment. I believe I can make a real difference in her life in ways that go beyond professional childcare. Thomas studied her face carefully, noticing the genuine passion and something deeper in her words and expression. There was definitely something more here, something she wasn't saying explicitly, but the sincerity of her desire to help was absolutely undeniable and moving. What about your family back home? He asked. Your own plans for the future that don't involve living with your employer? The question seemed to touch a sensitive nerve because Rebecca quickly looked away, blinking back moisture in her eyes. My family will understand, she responded in a voice that sounded rehearsed. And as for plans, well, caring for Emma feels like the most important plan I've ever had in my entire life. The raw honesty in her voice touched something deep in Thomas that had been dormant for years. For decades, he had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him: referrals, research opportunities, professional advancement through association with his reputation. But here was Rebecca asking for the opportunity to take on more responsibility and more work, without requesting anything extra in compensation, except the chance to better care for a baby who technically wasn't the responsibility of either of them. You speak about her as if she were... Thomas stopped mid-sentence, not being entirely sure how to finish that thought without making assumptions. As if she were what? Rebecca asked, though there was a tension in her voice suggesting she knew exactly what he was thinking. As if she were yours, Thomas finished gently, watching her reaction carefully. The silence that followed was dense and heavy, charged with unspoken emotions and truths that hung in the air between them. Rebecca looked down at Emma, who slept peacefully and completely oblivious to the conversation that was determining her future and the structure of her small world. Every child deserves to be loved as if they were your own, Rebecca finally responded in a voice thick with emotion. And while it was a beautiful sentiment, Thomas felt there were layers of meaning that he wasn't fully grasping or understanding. When would you like to move in? He asked, making the decision without his usual deliberation process. Rebecca's face transformed with a smile that was like watching a flower bloom in the middle of winter, rare and precious. You really agree to this arrangement? She whispered, as if unable to believe her fortune. More than agree, Thomas responded with certainty. I think it's exactly what Emma needs, what all three of us need, actually. That same afternoon, Thomas helped Rebecca transport her few belongings from the small apartment she shared with two other nurses in a less affluent neighborhood of Boston. He was genuinely surprised by how little she owned and how modest her living situation had been. One suitcase of clothing, a few medical textbooks, a framed family photograph, and curiously a small baby blanket that looked well worn but carefully preserved as if it held tremendous sentimental value. Is that from when you cared for your siblings? Thomas asked, gesturing toward the blanket she clutched protectively. Rebecca grabbed it quickly, holding it against her chest as if it were precious beyond measure. Yes, she responded, but her voice sounded distant and strained. It's very special to me for reasons I can't easily explain. Thomas noticed how her fingers caressed the soft fabric as if it were a talisman of some kind, a connection to something important in her past. As they settled her belongings into the bedroom adjacent to Emma's nursery, Thomas realized that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of his house and his life. It was no longer just his personal space, his private sanctuary from the demands of his medical career. Now it was a shared home, a place where something resembling a family was being created, whether he had planned for it or not. "Rebecca," Thomas said while she hung her limited wardrobe in the closet that seemed far too large for her possessions, "I want you to know that I genuinely appreciate what you're doing here. Emma is incredibly lucky to have you caring for her with such dedication." She turned toward him, and for a moment Thomas saw something vulnerable and deeply grateful in her expression that made him wonder about her story. "No, Dr. Bennett," she responded softly but firmly. "I'm the lucky one to have this opportunity." There was an intensity in her words that made Thomas question what exactly Emma meant to her and why she felt so fortunate to be able to care for this abandoned infant. The question that Rebecca had planted with her response intensified during the following days as Thomas observed an extraordinary transformation taking place in his formerly sterile and empty home. Emma seemed to flourish under Rebecca's constant care in a way that went far beyond simple improvements in her feeding schedule and sleep patterns. It was as if the baby had found exactly where she belonged in the universe, as if this had always been her destiny. Rebecca moved through the house with a serenity and sense of purpose that Thomas had never witnessed in her before during their professional relationship. Every morning, Thomas woke to the gentle sounds of Rebecca singing to Emma, melodies that seemed to come from somewhere very deep in her soul rather than from memory or children's songbooks. They weren't simply generic lullabies, but tunes that sounded personal and intimate, as if they had been created specifically for this particular baby. When Thomas came downstairs for breakfast, he always found the same beautiful scene that had become the highlight of his day. Rebecca feeding Emma while talking to her in a low voice, telling her about the day they had ahead together, about things they would see and experience, about how special and loved she was. Emma, for her part, seemed to absorb every word, every smile, every tender touch, as if she understood perfectly that she was receiving something extraordinary and precious. Thomas began lingering a bit longer each morning before leaving for the hospital, fascinated by this morning routine that had become the most beautiful part of his previously empty days. What intrigued Thomas most was the absolute naturalness with which Rebecca anticipated every single one of Emma's needs before they became urgent. Before the baby could even begin to fuss or show signs of discomfort, Rebecca already knew whether she was hungry, tired, or simply needed to be held and rocked. It was as if she had a sixth sense specifically calibrated for this particular child. "How do you always know what she needs?" Thomas asked one afternoon while watching Rebecca calm Emma with just a subtle change in how she was holding her. Rebecca blushed slightly as if she had been caught doing something secretive that she shouldn't be able to do. "I suppose some people are just naturally good with babies," she responded evasively. But Thomas noticed she avoided making direct eye contact with him. "It's more than that," Thomas insisted gently but persistently. "It's like you can read her mind and know exactly what she's thinking and feeling. I've never seen anything quite like this connection you two have." Rebecca smiled, but there was something melancholic in her expression that suggested complicated emotions beneath the surface. "Babies aren't that complicated, Dr. Bennett," she said in that carefully neutral voice. "They just need unconditional love and constant attention from someone who genuinely cares." But while saying this, Thomas noticed how her fingers automatically traced Emma's cheek in a gesture so intimate and unconscious that it seemed to bypass her conscious control entirely. "Have you ever wanted children of your own?" Thomas asked suddenly, surprising himself with the deeply personal nature of the question. Rebecca visibly tensed, and for a moment Thomas saw something that looked like pain flash across her face before she could control her expression. "We all want things we can't always have," Rebecca responded carefully, and her voice had become quieter and more guarded. "But sometimes God gives us opportunities to love in ways we never expected or planned for." Thomas felt he had touched something deep and possibly painful, so he decided not to press further or ask follow-up questions. But Rebecca's response stayed with him because it had sounded less like a general philosophy and more like a very specific personal experience she was alluding to without fully explaining. During the following days, Thomas began observing more carefully the small details of interaction between Rebecca and Emma. He noticed how she instinctively protected the baby's head when lifting her, how she knew exactly the temperature Emma preferred in her bottles, how she seemed to know when the infant was about to wake from her naps before any visible signs appeared. But more than that, Thomas noticed the small tears that sometimes appeared in Rebecca's eyes when she thought no one was watching her, especially when Emma slept, and she would just sit there gazing at her with an expression Thomas could only describe as deep longing mixed with unconditional love. It was the look of someone who loved intensely but was also carrying some kind of silent pain and grief. Thomas began to wonder what personal story was hidden behind such extraordinary devotion to an abandoned infant who should have been a stranger. One night, Thomas came downstairs for a glass of water and heard Rebecca's soft voice coming from Emma's nursery. He approached quietly, not to spy or eavesdrop, but because the melody she was singing was so hauntingly beautiful that he felt drawn to it like a moth to flame. "Sleep, my precious love," she sang softly with heartbreaking tenderness. "Tomorrow will be a new day full of wonder and adventure. Mama's here. We'll always be here taking care of you and protecting you from everything." Thomas stopped completely frozen in place. Had he heard correctly through the partially open door? Had she really said Mama, referring to herself? He moved closer, trying to hear better without making noise that would alert her to his presence. "Forgive Mama for not being able to have you with me from the very beginning," Rebecca's voice continued, now clearly broken by emotion and tears. "But now we're together, and that's what truly matters in this world." Thomas felt as if the ground was literally moving beneath his feet and his entire reality was shifting. His thoughts accelerated, racing to process what he had just heard and what it might mean. Was it possible? Was it actually possible that Rebecca was Emma's biological mother? But that would mean she had been the one to abandon the baby on his doorstep, that she had been acting and deceiving him this entire time, that she had been living an elaborate lie right under his nose. Thomas felt dizzy with the revelation, his mind oscillating between disbelief and a strange sensation that everything was finally starting to make complete and perfect sense. The instant connection between them, the intuitive knowledge of Emma's needs, the silent tears when she thought she was alone, the absolute devotion that went beyond professional childcare, everything pointed toward a truth that had been right in front of him the entire time. He returned silently to his bedroom, but sleep was absolutely impossible, with his mind racing through implications. His thoughts couldn't stop processing this new information and considering all its ramifications and complications. If Rebecca was truly Emma's mother, why had she abandoned her own child in such a desperate way? And why had she specifically chosen his doorstep out of all the places in Boston? Had she planned this entire elaborate scenario from the beginning with calculated precision? Thomas felt genuinely hurt by the deception and breach of trust, but simultaneously he couldn't deny what he had witnessed with his own eyes over these weeks. How much Rebecca loved Emma with every fiber of her being. If she was indeed the mother, then her pain and devotion were completely authentic and real, which somehow made the situation even more heartbreakingly complex rather than simpler. What circumstances could have possibly driven a mother who so clearly adored her child to abandon her in a basket on a stranger's doorstep? Thomas thought about the note that had accompanied Emma when he found her. "I have no other choice." Now those words carried a completely different weight and meaning. They weren't the words of a desperate stranger, but the anguished cry of a mother who had been forced to make an impossible decision that tore her heart apart. As he lay in the darkness of his bedroom staring at the ceiling, Thomas realized that despite the shock and sense of betrayal, what he felt most strongly was actually compassion rather than anger. Whatever circumstances had led Rebecca to that desperate decision, it was crystal clear that she had been suffering tremendously, had been carrying unbearable pain. The decision of what to do with his new suspicion tormented Thomas during several entire days of internal struggle and emotional confusion. But something unexpected began happening while he wrestled with this revelation. Every time he saw Rebecca caring for Emma with that absolute devotion and tenderness, every time he observed the way the baby calmed instantly in her arms as if that was her true home, Thomas felt something he had never experienced before in his carefully controlled emotional life. A deep desire to protect both of them from harm or separation. It didn't matter what circumstances had led to this unusual situation. What he could see clearly in front of him was a mother loving her child with every fiber of her being, and a baby flourishing under that unconditional love and care. For the first time in his adult life, Thomas began to understand what it truly meant to be part of something larger than himself and his career achievements. His daily routine started changing in subtle but significant ways that he barely consciously noticed. Instead of leaving immediately for the hospital in the mornings, he began staying longer, observing how Rebecca fed Emma, how she talked to her as if the baby could understand every word, how she rocked her to sleep with practiced movements. And to his own surprise, he began participating more actively in these morning rituals that had become sacred. "Can I help?" he asked one morning, extending his arms toward Emma in an offer to hold her. Rebecca looked at him with surprise but handed over the baby with a smile that illuminated the entire room and seemed to reach into his chest. Holding Emma for the first time with intention rather than necessity was an experience Thomas would never forget for the rest of his life. The little one was so light, so fragile and delicate, but at the same time so perfectly formed and alive. Her tiny hands automatically closed around Thomas's finger in that instinctive grasp reflex, and when she opened her eyes and looked directly at him with that serious baby stare, Thomas felt something shift fundamentally in his heart that he hadn't known could change. "Hello, little Emma," he murmured, surprising himself with the tenderness in his own voice that he rarely used. "I'm Thomas, and I've been helping take care of you along with Rebecca." Emma studied him with that intense seriousness that babies have, as if she were evaluating this new person in her small world and deciding whether to accept him. Then, to everyone's surprise, she smiled. A small, perfect smile that completely melted the defenses Thomas had built during 38 years of emotional protection. "She likes you," Rebecca said softly, and Thomas noticed there were tears forming in her eyes as she watched the interaction between them. It's rare for her to feel so comfortable with new people this quickly. Thomas looked toward Rebecca, and for a moment they shared a smile that felt incredibly intimate and natural, as if something was clicking into place. It was,